Health and wellness organizations getting fresh, locally grown produce to low-income people. This program started during the pandemic, but it's expanded thanks to the help of a grant funding. And Kristen Allen joining us in our newsroom this morning to explain how the program works.
Tammy, the produce is distributed at certain locations. One of them is Casa Alba Melanie in Green Bay. This is Wello's program, and it's called Cultivating Community, bringing the produce to socially disadvantaged and Black, Indigenous, and other people of color or BIPOC communities. If you're not familiar with the organization Wello, it works to address health equity challenges. Cultivating Community started in 2020 in response to the pandemic, and a new $180,000 grant will allow the program to continue and expand and include new community partners. We All Rise African American Resource Center is another distribution site. Staff there say that fresh fruits and vegetables aren't the norm in many Black households.
Truly, the expense of it is very high and just is not normalized in the community. It was time for us to now be able to introduce fresh produce to the most marginalized community, not only introduce it to them, but also help them understand what was being provided in the boxes with labels, and also from us being able to explain it to them, and also ingredients so they know how to prepare what's in the box.
There's also a new pilot program providing boxes of food for postpartum moms that include things like local organic baby food and fresh produce that is already sliced, peeled, and diced for new moms to eat as well. According to data in Brown County in Wisconsin, Black women are up to 4 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related complications than white women. Reporting in the newsroom, Kristen Allen, Action 2 News.